Thank you for joining us, both here and online, on this second Sunday of the month of May, otherwise known as the most important Sunday of the year, aside from maybe the year-end celebrations that we have and possibly Easter. Based on my attire, it must be Mother's Day, correct? Either that or my wife washed my white polos with red socks, which has occurred before, but not this time. We do have a treat today, a topical sermon focused on the celebration at hand, Mother's Day. So we'll take a break from Nehemiah, and we'll cover a section of 2 Kings chapter 8. And here, as opposed to finding a story in the Bible that focuses solely on mothers as far as an application, we are going to utilize a story that contains a mother, but the application is very much general. So whether you are a mother or a non-mother, it is going to be something useful for your edification. So again, the text that we will cover is 2 Kings chapter 8, and that's going to be from verses 1 to verse 6. So let me go ahead and read that, and you can follow along. Then Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, "Arise and go, you and your household, and stay wherever you can, for the Lord has called for a famine. And furthermore, it will come upon the land for 7 years." So the woman arose and did according to the saying of the man of God, and she went with her household and dwelt in the land of the Philistines 7 years. It came to pass at the end of 7 years that the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went to make an appeal to the king for her house and for her land. Then the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, "Tell me, please, all the great things Elisha has done." Now it happened, as he was telling the king how he had restored the dead to life, that there was a woman whose son he had restored to life, appealing to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son whom Elisha restored to life." And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed a certain officer for her, saying, "Restore all that was hers and all the proceeds of the field from the day that she left the land until now." This is actually a story that started a few chapters ago, chapter 4 of 2 Kings. And there we have the story of the prophet Elisha, who came after the prophet Elijah. So one was a disciple of the other, and Elijah got lifted up into the heavens, and Elisha kind of took over during this period of time as the main prophet of God, speaking on behalf of God and doing the things that prophets usually did in this time period in history. Now Elisha, he used to roam around, as you would expect, going into different places. And in chapter 4 of 2 Kings, we see that he would go by this lady's house. She is described there on the 4th chapter of 2 Kings as a notable Shunammite woman. She was from this place called Shunan. And again, she was notable, possibly even wealthy, somebody who was thought of as an important person in that society. And again, Elisha used to pass by her house on his ways to doing the things that prophets used to do. And she would offer up a meal, a drink, and eventually she talked to her husband and said, "Look, I know this is a man of God, so why don't we make this little nook in our house, this little resting place. So every time he comes by, not only do we offer him food and something to drink, but he actually can stay here and rest a little bit on his way to go about his businesses. And the husband agreed. So they set up a little place, and Elisha, whenever he went by this town, he would stop by this lady's house and rest and then be on his way. Eventually, Elisha was talking to his servant, this person here named Gehazi, and essentially asked him, what can we do to return the favor? This woman has been very hospitable. This woman has been very nice to us. Is there anything that you know that we can do to repay her, to bless her? And Gehazi mentioned that she did not have a son and her husband was already of age. So Elisha went up to her and said, look, this is what is going to happen. This is what I'm going to do to bless you. In this time next year, or by this time next year, you will have a son. And that came to be. She had a son within the span of 1 year. But then several years, they went by, and her son, after he was a little older, he acquired some type of sickness and eventually perished. He died. Now, obviously, the mother was distraught. We don't know about the father, if he was still alive or not. But the mother was very much saddened by the whole situation. So she went after Elisha because, again, he is the man of God and maybe he can do something about that situation. And eventually she caught up to Elisha. She held on to his legs or his feet, and Gehazi, the servant, tried to kind of shoo her away, but Elisha said, no, let her be. Something is happening here. God has not shown what is occurring, but she's obviously dealing with something pretty major. And then she went ahead and told Elisha, look, I didn't ask for a son, yet you gave me a son, but now he's dead. Almost like she wanted to return him, right? Have you ever bought something at the store and then it got spoiled and you wanted to exchange for something else? More or less like that. She said, look, I did not ask for a son. You blessed me with a son, but now he is dead. Is there anything that you can do about this situation? And Elisha obliged. Initially, he just took his staff, a stick, not, other servants, and he handed that off to Gehazi, and he told his servant to go into the household while they stayed where they were at, so that through this staff or through this stick that he would be able to revive the boy. Gehazi went. He tried to do this miracle, but was not able to do it. So he went back and told Elisha, look, I tried. I did everything that you told me to do, that you instructed me to do, but the boy is still dead. So Elisha said, okay, I'll take matters into my own hand. We'll go there together. And then Elisha, he entered the room that the boy was there just lying lifeless. And it's a very interesting description of what he did. He prayed initially and nothing happened. And then he went ahead and he laid down on top of the dead body with his eyes on top of the child's eyes, the boy's eyes, his mouth right on top of the boy's mouth, and his hands or arms extended out on top of that dead body. And then he got up, nothing happened. He did it again, and after that second time, he started noticing that the boy's body started getting warm, and then he sneezed or he coughed a few times, and then eventually he was revived, and he brought the mother in, and the issue was resolved. The boy was revived. And now, again, all of that happened in chapter 4 of 2 Kings. And now we fast forward to chapter 8 of 2 Kings, and we have an additional part of the story. This is a very well-known story, and usually people remember this first part of the story, but again, this is the last part of the story. And in the beginning of this chapter that I just read, Elisha went ahead and told this Shunammite woman, along with her child, and told her, look, there is a famine coming to the land. I encourage you to leave. and to leave for several years because this famine is going to last 7 years. So she heard and she listened and she obliged, right? She went away and lived in a Philistine area for 7 years. But now we see an issue. After these 7 years of famine, when it was over, she came back to her homeland. But when she came back to her homeland, it seemed like she had lost all of her property, everything that she owned. Again, she was a notable woman. She most likely was a rich woman. But when she came back, because she abandoned her place, now her property was actually owned by this current king that we see here described in chapter 8, Jehoram. He was a king of the northern kingdom, a king of Israel. And this was a huge issue. This was a big deal. How is this woman now coming back to her homeland? How is she going to survive without any of her property, any of her land? So she goes and she talks to the king because, again, now all of her property is in the king's possession. And to make matters worse, if we dive into the context, we will see how this situation was actually almost a hopeless situation. Why do I say this? If we think about this king's pedigree, it's somewhat of a concerning situation to be in. Do you know who this king's father was? This king's father was Ahab. Do you remember who Ahab was? Ahab was Jezebel's husband. I like to put that Jezebel was the one that wore the pants in the family, but he was technically the king. So Ahab was a very evil king. Every time the Bible lists a king and tells his story towards the end of his life, after he dies, there is a description of whether or not he was a good or bad king. And Ahab was one of the worst kings. His son was not very good. He was actually pretty bad. Not as bad as his father, but that was the pedigree. And there's a story about Ahab that fits right into the situation here. So Ahab, he had property, as you would imagine. He was a king. So next to his estate, there was a vineyard. And it was a vineyard that, he wanted for himself. He actually wanted to make it into a vegetable garden, of all things. He must have really liked his vegetables. So he went to his neighbor, and he talked to his neighbor and told him, look, I really want to take possession of your vineyard. And in exchange, I'll either pay a good sum of money, or I'll even give you a better vineyard. And this fellow, his neighbor, told him, look, can't do it. I am not going to sell off my inheritance to you. So Ahab got all upset. He went back to the palace, and he was literally pouting. He went to his bed. You know how kids of all ages do, right? He was just pouting and saddened, and just, again, was not having a good day. Jezebel came in and saw him dealing with something and asked, what is happening here? And Ahab told his wife, look, this is what happened. I went to my neighbor. I wanted to buy his vineyard. He does not want to sell me his vineyard. Boo-hoo. And then Jezebel looked at him and said, snap out of it. Aren't you the king? Why are you acting in this fashion? Here's what we'll do. I will send out some letters in your name, and I will gather people up for some type of a festival or gathering, and I will invite this neighbor of yours. And these people are going to gather, and he's going to be like the primary person in this gathering. But while they are having this gathering, a couple of people are going to accuse him of cursing God and the king. And then
I will instruct them to stone him to death. And that's what happened. The poor fellow received this invitation. He went because he was the guest of honor. And while they were there, a couple other people who were gathered stood up and claimed that he blasphemed against God and the king. And thereafter, they picked up stones and stoned him to death. And after that, Ahab was in the clear. He could just take for him this vineyard and make it into his vegetable garden, right? So thinking about this, thinking about the pedigree, now we have his son. And we have a son that now is in possession of this woman's property. Now, if you are this woman coming back to your homeland and you know this story, most likely, and you are going to the king, and essentially you're asking the king to return your possessions, that which now he owns. Doesn't seem very likely that it was going to end well. But she went because she had no other choice. She had no other alternative. She had to at least try. So, miraculously, as she was going to talk to the king, he was already having a conversation with this Gehazi fellow who used to be Elisha's servant, somewhat of a disciple. They had a little bit of a breakaway by this time. They weren't really a thing. But again, it was somebody who was pretty close to Elisha early on. And the king was actually curious about Elisha. He just wanted to know all of the stories and all of the things that Elisha had done, all of the miracles. So Gehazi was telling the king about all of these great stories pertaining to Elisha's ministry. And he got to the point where he was talking about this woman and what occurred to her. That Elisha went and miraculously not only made so that she could have a child, but eventually later on also revived this child. And just as he was telling this story, this woman comes in, makes this request, and then Gehazi said, "That's her. That is the woman, and that is the kid." Now, again, what a coincidence or God incidence, right? So the king was there. He was listening to Gehazi. He was experiencing, all of these stories. And then he sees this woman with her kid. And now there is this confirmation as to who she was and how significant she was pertaining to the story that he was hearing. So he went ahead and told her, "Look, no problem at all. I will go ahead and give you back all of your property. But not only give you all of the property, all of the proceeds from these 7 years that you have been gone, you will also be paid for that." Wow. What a Mother's Day. Wouldn't you agree? What a Mother's Day present. The title of the message is "The Lord's Providence." And the reason why I picked this story, again, that includes a mother, it's because this Shunammite woman is a perfect example of how God provides. But it is an interesting example because we see the ups and downs of God's providence. Usually when we think about God's providence, the Lord's providence, we think of it almost like an exchange of favor or a one-time deal. God provided me with this or that. With this particular need, He saved me from this horrible outcome. He is the God of providence. But actually, when we think about God and Him being the God of providence, that's actually a long-term deal. God provides constantly. God's provisions, it ebbs and flows throughout our lives. It's not just a particular time of history. It's not just one singular incident. It's not just when, something horrible is happening. God's providence occurs all throughout our lives. And once again, it is a great example of this fact. Why? Because we see God's providence being displayed in this woman's life. We see from the beginning of her story that somehow God instilled upon her heart to be very hospitable to this man of God, Elisha. She provided meals for him. She provided room and board. She provided for his ministry as he was going on his way and back from wherever he wanted to go. And as a consequence to that, Elisha felt inclined to bless her and give her a child, something that otherwise would not have occurred. But then what happened thereafter? This child died. Now, I told you the story. She was literally upset. Upset at Elisha because she said, I never asked for a child. Do you have a return policy? Is there an exchange program here? Because literally now I've had this child. I've been attached to this child. I love this child, but now I've lost this child. So in one sense, I am worse off than I was before, because at least before, I did not have this loss. I might have been saddened because I did not have a son or a daughter, but now it's even worse because I had him and now I lost him. That period of her life was still part of God's providence. It wasn't the end of the story. It was just a particular part of the umbrella of God's providence. And just imagine if the story ended right there in her head and in her heart. The blessing, the providence would seem like a curse. But the story went on, and she allowed the story to go on. And as the story unfolded, she reattained her son. And she saw that this was really good. But then the story continued, right? Elisha went ahead and told her, hey, you better go somewhere else because there's going to be a lot of suffering for the next 7 years. And you will be better off in another region, in another place. So she listened. Why wouldn't she listen? Went ahead and went away. When she came back, come on. Really? I listened to you. I obeyed your advice. I know you are a man of God, and you were trying to look out for me. So I left, and I left for these 7 years, but now I come back, and I have nothing. I should have just stayed. I am worse off than I was before. Maybe I would have hungered a little bit, but other people might have survived during the famine. It wouldn't have been great, but at least I would have had my land. At least I would have my possessions. And now I have nothing. This king, who is the son of a very horrible king, not so bad, but not really good, he has my land. I lost everything because I listened to you, because I heard your advice, because I obeyed. And if it just ended right there, in her mind and in her heart, what kind of providence is that? Isn't God's providence supposed to be a blessing? And at that stage, it was anything but. But the story goes on. And God continues to show that he provides. Now again, the umbrella of God's providence, there are ups and downs. And at a particular moment, it may not seem much of a blessing. It may not seem much of a privilege or something positive. All throughout, she was obeying. all throughout, she was doing that which was right before God. But in particular stages of her life that did not seem very beneficial, her son died. She lost all of her possessions. But again, God was still providing. And the encouragement that we have here, the very general encouragement for mothers and non-mothers is this: understand the God that provides. Know him. Know how he works. It's not just a one-time deal. It's not just a singular blessing. It's not just things that you view as positive. Throughout your life, if you believe in the God that provides, don't get stuck into this perspective of him not doing that which he promised because you are experiencing something negative. If you believe in the God that provides, all you have to do is wait. That particular situation that may be very much negative, very much unexpected, something that you even view more as a curse rather than a blessing. When things seem bleak, if you believe in the God that provides, all you have to do is wait. Wait for the story to unfold, and you will experience providence once again. Amen.